school in DC at Georgetown University, and experiencing the attacks on September 11th definitely had an impact on me, and I'm sure my entire generation of students. And that is what prompted me to want to study Muslim societies more. I had 20 plus years of a very intensive Islamophobia industry, where their entire message is constantly to paint every Muslim in the world as someone negative, someone dangerous.
And I've experienced backlash. Have you been targeted for doing what you do?
Yeah, I think unfortunately I have. I was very opposed to the policies of President George Bush and his approach to Muslim majority countries and some of the things that he would say. And so I became involved in campaigning for President Obama when he ran.
Okay.
And that was my first involvement in electoral politics. I have a passion for meeting the needs of all of those who are under-resourced and who don't have the representation that they need. And
Assalamu alaikum, this is Amina. Welcome back to New Wave of Nayador. Today I'm in conversation with someone who's no stranger to making history, shattering glass ceilings. She was elected as mayor of Montgomery, New Jersey twice, the first ever South Asian woman to achieve that feat, and the first ever Muslim to be elected as mayor of any township in US. She then went on to be the first South Asian Muslim woman to be elected to NJ legislature, Assemblywoman Dr. Sadaf Jaffer. Thank you. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us.
Sure.
It's a pleasure having you here.
glad to meet with you.
Welcome. So Sadaf, a bachelor's in foreign affairs, and then a doctorate in Eastern languages and civilization from Harvard, and then a researcher and a professor at Princeton University. How did you end up being in politics?
I always had an interest in public service. I think growing up, our family was very informed with what was happening around the world. They watched the news. I think growing up, visiting Pakistan, visiting Yemen, visiting lots of countries throughout the world, I just had that perspective of how life could be very different, but also very similar.
Okay.
So I thought I might go into diplomacy in college, but then I became very interested in my research on history and literature, and that's what led me to do a PhD and eventually to an academic position at Princeton University. But I always had that interest in public service, and so I wanted to make a difference, and I started to think about local government as somewhere that you could make a difference wherever you might be based in the country.
Yeah, usually, I'm not saying that we shouldn't. I think we need more people like you in politics than anything else, but it's not a usual combination. Like academics and politics do not usually go together.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think that makes it you different from other politicians that you come across?
Mm-hmm.
Do you bring something extra to the mix?
Certainly, I think having a strong background in research skills is very useful in elected office, because you have to make decisions on a whole host of different issues that you might not be an expert on,
Right.
but that have a lot of repercussions for society. So,
Right.
For example, I was mayor during 2020 when the COVID pandemic came to Montgomery Township, and I looked at lots of research in terms of how to lead during a pandemic. I looked at historically what had happened during pandemics. I was very much paying attention to what was happening globally when it came to the pandemic. So I think that served my community very well. We were able to maintain some of the lowest COVID infection and fatality rates in the state, I think because we were very proactive. And I certainly think having a background, having research skills, having a global perspective serves constituents in a local township as well.
That's great. So basically critical thinking, you brought it into the mix, into politics, and definitely use it to your advantage, as going by your example of your response to the pandemic. You mentioned briefly while we were in the beginning of the conversation that diplomacy was where you thought you were headed, but then you ended up being in public service. And I was during my research, what came up was that maybe 9/11 was that defining moment for you. Mm-hmm. Was that the case?
I think, being a freshman in college, just the first week of school, actually, and I was going to school in DC at Georgetown University, and experiencing the attacks on September 11th definitely had an impact on me, and I'm sure my entire generation of students. And that is what prompted me to want to study Muslim societies more. And eventually, I lived in India for 2 years. I have done research on, Muslim writers and intellectuals. That became a passion of mine to educate the public through my research and through my students. But then I also saw a more direct way to be that example of a Muslim South Asian who's involved in public service in their local community as well.
So your involvement in politics, do you think it was driven somewhat by the fact that Muslims were so misunderstood, especially following that event?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that kind of, because it was the driving factor, or part of the drive was to portray a different image of Muslims?
Yeah, I think it was to present reality that certainly, some people have done horrible things in the name of Islam, or, but that doesn't represent the entirety of Muslims in the world today, which are 25% of the world's population, or historically, that there have been many different diverse ways of being a Muslim. And actually, one of the reasons why I'm, proud to teach about Islam in South Asia is that if you put together all the countries in South Asia, it's the biggest, the region with the most Muslims in the world. And I don't think people realize that. So it's important for us to think about, the Islam that we practice in South Asia is actually much more common and much more normative. And then I think, I was very opposed to the policies of President George Bush and his approach to Muslim majority countries and some of the things that he would say. And so I became involved in campaigning for President Obama when he ran.
Okay.
And that was my first involvement in electoral politics, because I saw the huge impact that whoever is the leader gets to make. And then when I, in my advocacy was calling my congressperson and was very disappointed in their position, that's when I started to think that maybe people like myself should be the decision makers, because you can advocate, and it's very important to advocate, but ultimately the person in that seat gets to decide how they're going to vote.
Right. Okay. So over the period of years, I mean, we're going back to 2011, and then here we are in 2023. Do you think Islamophobia has changed? Do you think we've moved forward? Have people's perspective changed?
I think, sadly, it's gotten worse. Because I think right after September 11th, lots of Americans who are not Muslim were just like, I don't know anything about Islam, or, they didn't really know how to read what this was. But I would say now we've had 20 plus years of a very intensive Islamophobia industry, where their entire message is constantly to paint every Muslim in the world as someone negative, someone dangerous. And I think in a certain segment of the population in America, they've come to believe that misinformation is fact, and they just have these outlandish sorts of beliefs, like, oh, Muslims can lie, and Muslims can do this, and Muslims are told they have to kill everyone who's not Muslim. And I'm like, this isn't even making sense, but they've been told that over and over and over, and they've heard it on the, whatever news programs they're watching, and they've read it in whatever books they're reading. So I think it's hard to undo that sort of programming and messaging. I do think, on the other hand, in more cosmopolitan spaces where there are more Muslims, when people see that personal example, when they have a doctor who's Muslim, or an elected official or anything like that, that does change the narrative. But I wouldn't say that we are in a much better place. I think there's a lot of challenges. It's almost as if there's two realities in this country at the same time. Some people who are living in this space where they're so fearful and they think anything different is dangerous, and they certainly have especially a fear of Muslims. And then there is another space where there are more opportunities opening up. So in your experience, and what do you think is the best way to break that rhetoric, or change the mindset? I know you started off a group called Mosaic, which was sort of directed not just against Islamophobia, but anti-Semitism, and then against racial discrimination against
minority populations. So is that something, that can help, and what other things would change that rhetoric?
Yeah, so during my first year in elected office, there was an anti-Muslim bias crime in my town where someone left pork on a Muslim family's car.
Wow.
And, the mayor at that time said, well, we don't really know what's motivating it, and unless it happens again, it's not really a pattern. And I was able to share research that pork is used to target Muslims, and that Islamophobia is a type of racism, and that if you don't address bias crimes when they first start happening, they tend to escalate. And so it's very important to address things right away. And yes, I started a discussion group called Montgomery Mosaic, where we discuss things like anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, because I didn't want to make it a one-off discussion. I wanted a sustained conversation.
Right.
And we actually had the first 2 sessions in a synagogue in town, and then we had some other discussions at some of the different churches in town and community centers. And I think that that was a really important way to build community. I think that the local space is very promising, because a lot of times the hate, people say it from behind screens when they're very far away. When you see someone face to face and you see their humanity, I think some of that hate naturally, hopefully dissipates. And so I think the local space is a promising one, but we have to be very active, and we have to be in solidarity. Like, we cannot only think about Muslim issues. We have to think about how to address racism. We have to think about how to address misogyny. All of these types of hate, one of the things that I'm not the first to say this, but hate just keeps growing and growing. And so we can't think, oh, well, they're not attacking us, so it's okay. Eventually it's going to come to us. Yes. So it's really important to build a more inclusive society for everyone.
And one of your other things that you're passionate about is racial justice, right? And advocating for minorities, advocating for women, advocating for underprivileged children. So how has that evolved for you during your service as a mayor, and then now as an assembly person?
Yes, definitely. I have a passion for meeting the needs of all of those who are under-resourced and who don't have the representation that they need. And to some degree that stems from who is serving an elected office. It's mostly men, mostly, white people, mostly Christians, mostly wealthier people, traditionally. And I think over time that is changing, but then that means that the needs of the rest of society don't get heard as much.
Right.
So, some of the examples that I give are, for example, in the COVID pandemic, some of the undocumented members of the community in Montgomery were afraid to go to the food pantry because they thought there might be some immigration enforcement taking place there. And so the township developed a system to deliver that food aid to them so they wouldn't have to go to a space where they didn't feel safe. And I raised this with some of my fellow elected officials, and they seemed very surprised. Like, oh, I haven't heard this. Why would they be afraid? And how come you heard this when I've never heard this? And I realized I was the only person from an immigrant background who was in elected office. So maybe they felt more comfortable approaching me with this issue.
So just because it seemed like you were more of a representative of that community, right? Because there's a huge South Asian population in your township, right? So they probably felt more comfortable, and they thought that maybe their concerns would resonate with you more.
Right.
And that brings you back to the point that if you want to help, you have to be there to be in a position to be able to help. Because if you're not their representative and they have that majority white male population as their representative, their voice may not be heard.
Right.
So that's actually really helpful for the community. The other thing that while I was researching you, that came up was that you teach feminism and secularism through the lens of Islam and pertaining to women, and that's also a very, very unique topic. How does that gel in with what you're doing over here?
Yeah, well, I think I am all about questioning some of the received narratives that we have. And, as you and I were discussing, after September 11th, there were the messages saying, well, this is what Islam is. Muslims are violent and they, want a certain type of politics. And the more that I research the breadth of Islamic society and history, you learn about the significance of the arts, and that Muslim societies had had very much of a tendency to be humanistic and inclusive, and especially when you look at Islam in South Asia, the way in which Muslim rulers in India dealt with religious diversity is actually something that Europeans were like, oh, that's an interesting example. They seem to accept the differences there. And then in the modern period as well, not every Muslim thinker has wanted religion and politics to be closely linked. There have been secular thinkers, and there have been activists who have wanted a separation between religion and politics from the Muslim community as well. But for some reason they're discounted, or we just don't study them as much. So I wanted to bring attention to that, first to the role and the significance of arts and culture in Muslim societies, and then also to this diversity of thought. That yes, there are those political movements in Muslim societies that have wanted religion and politics to be very enmeshed, but there's also those who haven't.
Right.
And so we have to understand all of those possibilities to really get a broad and accurate representation of what's possible in Muslim societies.
Because you're right, secularism is an entirely foreign concept in Muslim politics. It's not something that's readily accepted and even talked about. So I thought that was very interesting to bring that into mix and actually make it the population aware, or your students aware, that such a thought process actually exists.
Right.
Yeah.
And it has historical precedence. It's not, secularism is a system that was developed in a global conversation, and Muslim societies were very much a part of that conversation.
Right.
It's not that it was developed somewhere else and then exported, because actually the types of fundamentalism that we see in Muslim societies today, that's also a modern construct. So to say that, well, this political system is, we're all living in modernity. So there's nothing more authentic or ancient or Islamic about wanting a certain type of mix of religion and politics than there is to want a separation.
True. But I'm glad people like you are bringing such concepts and making public aware of them, that they exist. And I think that speaks to the whole narrative of changing the perspective of Islam, getting rid of Islamophobia and all that. I see you also talk about political cynicism, because again, there is also in the modern era or recent years, there's this narrative that people are maybe running away from politics. They don't think it's the best way to serve the people because they don't think they can actually get to do what they want to do. So what's your take on that?
Well, I would say that the vast majority of us, we have an appreciation for democracy, right? We didn't want to be colonized by, Europeans, either in South Asia or in the United States. We wanted to have self-rule, to have representation, to have a government that was by the people, by our peers. And so I think if you value democracy, then you can't hate all politics, and you can't hate all of those who serve in public service.
True.
Because the two go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other.
Right.
And actually, I think pervasive cynicism serves the worst actors, because then they can say, oh, everyone is terrible. So just let me, I'm no worse than they are, so you might as well just ignore what I'm doing and let me do what I want. And so I think actually it's very dangerous when we start to accept that. Like, oh, just write off politics. Everyone who's involved is terrible. I think, the vast majority of people that I've worked with in public service are trying to do the right thing. They want to serve their communities. They're in it because they care. Because it is honestly a sacrifice in so many different ways.
Yeah, I would think so.
So I think I think it's good to have a healthy skepticism, but pervasive cynicism where you think everything is terrible and there's no help is actually counterproductive. And it's not even accurate, because so many people have fought and died for us to have these rights, to have political rights.
Yeah.
And so we should respect those sacrifices that were made and participate and make the change that we can. We should appreciate the rights that we do have. And yes, things could be better. There are definitely problems, but we can't write it all off as, oh, it's just, as horrible as it can be. No, it could, if we allow our democracies to collapse, it could be much worse. And so it's important.
And I
that
think that stands true for all institutions of life. It's just not pertinent only to politics, right? There's good and bad everywhere. And if you want to change, you can't do it by standing on the sidelines. You have to become a part of the process to help the process along. During this whole journey, have you experienced backlash? Have you been targeted for doing what you do?
Yeah, I think unfortunately I have, and a lot of the negativity does mostly focus on being a Muslim elected official and fear that people have, or just hate that they have towards Muslims, and then to some degree as well, being of an immigrant background or being a racial minority also makes some people upset when they see leaders from minority backgrounds. And then on a third level, I think that there is a lot of hostility towards women in politics, and we're treated a little bit differently, or we're thought of a little bit more negatively than men. So all of those compound.
Triple whammy.
Yes, and I have dealt with that. So it's unfortunate. I think it'll change over time as people's idea of what a leader looks like changes, and they get more used to it. And when we have more people, because when there's a few, all of that attention, negative is focused. And I think as you see more people, it'll just become normal. And I hope that, future generations won't have to face that sort of intense negative attention.
So despite the hardship that you've dealt with or the backlash that you've faced, you would still advocate for more participation from minorities, from women, from people of color, from different religions. So, the representation increases, right? It hasn't put you off, it hasn't turned you off, and you wouldn't, like, let's say if you were to advocate for it to your child, you would still advocate for it.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, decided not to seek re-election this year. So it's a decision that I made to some degree based on some of the challenges that I faced.
Okay.
But I'm still staying involved. I actually just became the chair of my local Democratic Party in my town, and I'm helping other candidates run. So I think, I would never demand it of people that, you have to run.
Yeah.
Because yes, there are sacrifices. Yes, it can be a struggle. And each one of us has to check in with, our willingness, our ability, our personal responsibilities. But I think if anybody has an inclination,
you would be supportive.
Say, yes, absolutely. And I think, as I mentioned, the more people who get involved, the easier it'll be, and will become a support system. And, I think we can think of it in the sense of like the first generation of women to maybe go to college, or, the first generation of even South Asian doctors in this country. Now there's so many, but like at a certain time when it was in the early days, there wouldn't have been many, and it would have been very difficult. So I think you have to kind of build the norms and the networks and the support systems. And I think that will come with time. But, I think it's definitely a worthwhile exercise, and it only will serve everyone, better. If we know the needs of the community, if you can advocate. One of the questions that I often get is it better to be within the system or outside the system? And my answer to that is you need both. You need those advocates who are very passionate, who are very knowledgeable, who are pushing things in the good direction. But then you also need those people who are in positions of power, who are friendly to your cause, who understand and who want to be the people who are going to propose legislation and support legislation. So, everybody has their own desires and their own skill sets and comfort levels, but we need people on all sides of governance and policy making and advocacy if we want to move things in a good direction.
Yeah, it brings us back to something that you referred to earlier on in the conversation, where you were advocating for a council person or your representative, and you were trying your best. But since they didn't see eye to eye with you, there was nothing you could have done to change their mind. So yes, you do need advocates on the outside, but then you definitely need people on the inside too, so they can carry your perspective to where it needs to be carried to. Yeah. So definitely, and again, there are challenges, especially when you're at this time point where you're breaking barriers, you're shattering ceilings, and then those times are more challenging. But as more and more people get involved, it gets easier.
So I think so.
Yeah. Okay. That's. I think that's a great message for the youth, for the minorities, for women, for people of color, for people coming in from different religion and cultural backgrounds, to keep trying, because that's the only way you're going to make a difference. Sitting on the sidelines is never going to help.
Yes, and I would say that, I was elected.
Yes.
I was elected to local office. I was elected to state office. And I think there were, I'm sure, people who were skeptical about that.
Yeah.
That, is the population really going to come out and vote for a minority candidate, for a Muslim candidate, and for a woman candidate? And they did. So I think that that's an example that we should never think, this isn't possible in this area, or, anything is possible.
Right.
If we convince our fellow citizens that our message is compelling, and that, we have good ideas for the community. That's really the most important thing in politics.
And you came without a political background, right? It's not like you had a political family or you had any political backing. It's just on your own merit. So it's totally doable.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Sadaf, for talking to us. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Same here.